Call the meeting to order at 6:01. Welcome, and I guess we are also streaming live on Facebook. Thank you, Mr. Perrin, for arranging that. So, no, that wasn't you? Oh, BCTV. Oh, well, you get blamed for a lot of stuff. You should get credit as well. So thank you for coming to the WSESD Budget Information Session. So I think I'll start at the beginning, especially because we're live streaming this. What is the WSESD? So the WSESD is the towns of Guilford, Brattleboro, Dummerston, and Putney that were merged as of July 1, and also the former BUHS number 6 district. This now is one district providing education for all the children in that town. We have a sister district, Vernon, that did not merge. Because of that, we have another structure, the WSESU. It's a supervisory union structure, and that provides certain kinds of services to students in the WSESD and our sister district, Vernon. So some of the differences are, because this is important in budgeting, because some of the things by statute are going to be budgeted through the SU and some of them through the SD. So at the SU level, the services provided to Vernon and WSESD are the superintendent's office, fiscal service, curriculum coordination, special education, transportation, and actually food service is in there too. There's a whole laundry list of services that are funded at the SU level. At the school district level, both for Vernon and for the WSESD, the budgets include costs for principals' offices, regular education, guidance, building, maintenance, paraprofessionals, the things that you would normally see in your school budget. Any questions? Talk louder? Okay. Oh, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
I have a question, Manager.
Yes. Can you just state your name?
Jody Normando, Dummerston. Special ed, you say, is provided by the SU, but
Oh, yeah, you need a mic. Sorry, thank you.
Would you like me to be a runner?
I can do a runner today.
It's my favorite job.
special ed is saying is provided by the supervisory union. However, Vernon doesn't get it through the supervisory union shared like we do they? They pay for all of theirs.
So yes and no, Jody. Well, we all pay for all of ours. I mean, it just doesn't, in the end, we all pay. So Vernon's kind of a different case. There's a lot of cases like that around the state. People that have tuition in, the payment is done a little bit differently. But to be sure, we're all paying the supervisory union back for the special education services that are provided. So, I've only talked about who provides the services because that's where they're going to land in the budget. So maybe I'll go a little further and then I think I'm going to turn it over to Frank because I think I could almost explain how Vernon's special ed reimbursement happens. It's not entirely, well, I guess it is because we have to pay for the SU. But let me go a little further and talk about what's happening so that people will actually understand the question as well. So the WSESU has a $22.7 million budget, give or take, and that is on page 48 of your 2020 annual report. And those services are provided to the WSESD and Vernon. And then the WSESD and Vernon have to reimburse the WSESU for those services. So that question that Jody is asking is, we receive services, we reimburse the SU based on a couple of different formulas. I think Frank must have spent the whole month of October working on these formulas. So by statute, SUs must provide special education. So Vernon students that attend Vernon School reimburse the SU, and it's averaged out through all those students in the whole Vernon K through 6 and the WSESD K through 12 on a per student basis. So it's based on your equalized pupil number, and the money is then reimbursed to the SU for providing services. In the case of Vernon students that are 7 through 12, the costing is a little different because they're not averaged out with all of our students because they're really not part of this district, but they're still part of the SU because it's tuition. Is that clear enough? Maybe I'm going to phone a friend. I'm just wondering if maybe, I'm kind of in the weeds here, so maybe I could have Frank respond later. But it's a very complex model. In the case of transportation, there are 14 buses, I believe. Vernon has 3, so they pay for the cost of 3 buses. In the case of food costs, different districts reimburse based on the food. In the case of superintendent services, fiscal services, curriculum coordination, it's all on the basis of the number of students. But special ed was a very tricky calculation this year. It's on BCT TV too, if you want a full and thorough explanation if you're still not completely on board with it. So if you went to page 48 and looked at our SU budget, there were pretty significant cost increases in a couple of areas. And at the SU level, special education costs were up $2.5 million, basically due to students moving in the area that have increased needs and general increased needs. So that's a pretty significant increase that we have to reimburse the SU for. There was also, I believe last year, maybe 2 years ago, Brattleboro Union High School went to a Provision 2 free lunch program, and the reimbursements didn't work out quite as we expected, so the cost to support that program, which is free lunch for all BUHS students, is going to be approximately $200,000 more than last year. So then at the WSESD, there's other factors that are affecting our tax rate as well. A $700,000 increase in health insurance rate, that's really dictated by the state now. Increased salaries and a net of 3.4 additional staff, that's a $500,000 increase. The food service that we have to pay back to the SU for providing the food service at the high school level, $200,000. And I think I don't have that number right. I think it's not 200K, but I think it's more than that. But special education reimbursement to the SU is also increased. I think that's closer to $500,000. But we have some things that brought down our tax rate. We actually have an increased number of equalized pupils. So I think we have close to an additional 30 equalized pupils this year. So that helps bring down our tax rate. And we had several retirements, so while that's not always a great thing, it does when you take a teacher who is at the top end of their pay scale and bring in generally a younger teacher, that will also reduce our tax rate. So the other thing that's affecting our budget this year is last year the board voted to use $1 million in reserve funds to bring down the tax rate, and this year we chose to use about $800,000 to reduce the tax rate, so that has an effect of increasing our tax rate slightly, but we felt that there's so much going on in the legislature right now that we're not very certain about what's going to happen, that we thought it was a good idea to keep the money in our fund balance and not spend down anymore. And we had about an hour and a half discussion about that, so it's been clearly vetted that the board agrees this is the most prudent thing to do when the legislature's making a lot of changes for us, as usual. So the bottom line on the overview of the budget is our expenditures are up 1.8%, which is actually in line with inflation right now. However, our net education spending is up about 5%, and that is pretty close to what's happening statewide, and things like a 12% increase in health insurance when we are a large employer. Our biggest line item is employees, so that is going to hit our bottom line. And our equalized rate is $1.74. But wait, there's more. Ooh, I could have made a bigger font. Sorry, that's what happens when you make a PowerPoint at lunchtime. You don't vet it completely. So it's not over when we get to the tax rate, because we have different communities and statute requires that we adjust the tax rate for how the market value of our houses compare to the tax assessment. So for example, right now in Dummerston, houses are selling for slightly less than their tax appraised value. So in order to make it fair, there's a factor that the state calculates every year. Some guy, someplace, some woman, someplace calculates this, what's called the CLA. So you take that rate that we all share, $1.74, you divide that by each town's CLA, and that gives you your town tax rate. And I rounded the numbers. They go out one more decimal, but it would have been a smaller font probably. So there's another factor in figuring out your actual tax rate is most Vermonters pay their tax rate on something called income sensitivity. Our rate is 2.83, but it's a very complex formula because it's based on $200,000 of home value plus 2 acres, and it phases out as you get higher in your income level. So a family of 5 making $40,000 a year as a family income would, no matter what their house was appraised at up to $200,000, they would not pay more than 2.83% of their taxes, and it phases out at around $140,000 a year income. That's it. So I thought we could maybe go through and just take an overview of page 12 of the annual report. And I can just show you how these numbers affected the tax rate this year. So it's a state form. Keep turning to page 12 till you find something that's clearly a state form. So the top line, number 1, the budget, those are all of our expenditures, which for the WSESU that we have reimbursed now, our portion. So our total spending for the WSESD is $51,171,300. Now, we get grants, we have tuition coming into we have a lot of tuition students at the high school, a growing number of tuition students at the high school, I hope. And so we get to take that off of our expenditures to get our net education spending, which is $42,654. You can see that big, bold education spending number. So if you go down the next line, you can see the number of equalized pupils. And if you look at last year, we had 2,234. This year we have 2,253 students. So these aren't exactly students in chairs. You get, the state takes all the students and they give values based on, at this point, what somebody thought of was the good number to use. So for example, if you have a preschool student, that student counts as 0.46. But if you have a high school student, they count as 1.13?
We do now.
Yeah, right now, 1.13. Because the thought is it costs more because you have so many different classes you need to teach, it costs more, and so many more facilities you need, full labs, that it costs a little bit more to educate a high school student. So they put all the students, figure out all the values. A student learning English might cost more, so there's a value associated to this. So it roughly equates to the fact that we probably have more students, but it might mean that we have more high school students, fewer pre-K students, more students learning English, so those values will affect that number. But the good news is that higher number means our per pupil cost comes down. So it brings our per pupil spending down to $18,932. That's in line 16, education spending per equalized pupil. We did not go over the threshold this year because some of our spending is from capital improvement work we did, so that we don't have to pay a penalty for doing that. So you see a couple numbers down there that we can happily ignore this year. It's a number that every school board member looks to first when Frank hands us this page. Are we over the excess spending threshold? Because then every dollar you spend, you get penalized another dollar. So you take that number and in very tight, that 18,932, if you look in very small letters, it says the threshold. That's the excess spending. And then you go down and you see it says 174%. That number is taking the yield. If you look below that 174%, it said based on yield, 10,883. That's a number determined at the state level that you divide our per pupil figure by the yield, and that we're 174% of the yield. So if you just move your decimal point, that 174% becomes a tax rate, shazam, of $1.74. If you look down further, so that's our district rate. So if everybody's house was selling in all of our towns for exactly what the house was tax appraised value at, that would be your tax rate. If your house is selling, if the houses in your community are selling more than that rate, then your tax rate, your actual effective tax rate will go up. And that's just how it is at the state level. We didn't make that up here. In fact, everything on this sheet is decided by statute and the state to help our taxes be transparent and clear to everyone involved. How's it working for you? Also, if you came in, we had a great gift on the board this year. In the past, it is in the Brattleboro Charter that the Brattleboro Finance Committee will independently review, and they are appointed by the town meeting members. Is that right? Yes. So it's people who maybe stayed late enough and weren't paying attention when they asked for volunteers that will actually take this whole budget, review it. They come to our meetings and ask questions, and they prepare a report reviewing what we're doing with our fund balances, how we're spending our money, and they have traditionally always done this for the Brattleboro Town Schools and the Brattleboro Union High School Board. This year they did it for all of us, which meant they did probably 40% more work reviewing it. But this report is on the way in if you want to take a look at it. And I hate to bury the lead, they recommend passage of the budget. But it's a gift no matter what to the school board, because it was very helpful for us to have a set of eyes checking our work and being able to recommend to the voters the correct thing, what their opinion was on our work. This packet here is all the backup that goes into your annual report. What we did this year, rather than try to have all these annual reports printed, it would have been heavy, unwieldy, and really hard to follow with all these schools. So we have summaries of all the different schools' spending, really broken down by broad categories. So if you have a question about what's happening in your school with spending, and why did this number go up, why did that number go up? Between all of us, somebody can answer that question. What have I forgotten? Anything? So I'm happy to open it up to questions.
Richard Mills from Dummerston. Good evening.
Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? I'll take maybe you all can pass this on, and I can, because this one will reach to all of us.
You want to come up?
Nice.
Good evening, people. Can you explain to me how the state comes up with that yield? I'm sure it's a number that they come up with, and when do you get that number?
I'm going to phone a friend for that one, because I kind of know it's how much money they have versus what they think they're going to spend, and it's not done yet because they're still working on it. But Frank will do it.
I can't add a whole lot to that. That's the general concept. They ask for preliminary board-approved budgets in February. The legislature does. The Agency of Ed collects that data. It's shared with the legislature. They look at common level appraisal statistics that come in from the town listers, so they have a sense of what does the state property values look like in general. And then they say, okay, here's proposed spending. Here's changes in the CLA. So based on that type of data, they then project, as Christina articulated, it's the denominator that the entire state uses in terms of school board budgets to divide by. And you can see how simple that math is in terms of projecting essentially the effect of a statewide property tax. The reason why they do all of this sort of preliminary work is so before they adjourn in June, they set that number so that they're confident the education fund will receive enough money to pay out all of those budgets that have been passed by voters.
That's a consistent number throughout the state, though.
It is a consistent number. It's printed at the very top of page 12, and I've added the prior year for reference. So you see this, when we say prior year from a budget point of view, when we're talking about fiscal year 21, Christina's mentioned the 10,883. That's a proposed number that's estimated by the legislature based on what we just talked about. The 10,648 is the actual number that was used to set this fiscal year's tax rates. And yes, it's the same number across the state.
I think last year that they kept the legislature an extra week. That was one of the last things they were figuring out was what the yield was going to be, because Scott wanted it different than the legislature wanted it. So yeah, these are only preliminary tax rates. We make our best guess, and as you remember, we make our best guess, and then it all depend on how the ed fund spending looked. Earlier, they were saying they thought budgets were going to be a little lower than projected, but I don't think that's true anymore. So,
Well, the last I've heard from the Agency of Ed, as a result of collecting the preliminary budgets, is that the tax commissioner's estimate, you remember in December that was shared with all the school boards, I think estimated about a 5% increase in education spending across the state. It appears that that's coming in a little bit lower. So they're suggesting that yield number is probably going to go up a little bit, which is going to bring our tax rates down. So they're not being specific at this point, but the implication is it's going to be a favorable adjustment.
Jody Normandow.
Is this on? I guess it is. I have several questions, but maybe ask one at a time.
Yeah.
Okay, the capital plan,
So that's on,
page 23.
oh, thank you.
It appears, and I was not at a meeting where you discussed this, so you may have answered it along the way, but looking at the 5-year plan, it appears that there's quite a discrepancy between the different schools as to how much you are doing for them. And I've tried to go through and find out exactly what was happening. And so my question, I guess, is how do you come up with these issues? Like Dummerston doesn't have anything in the 5th year, Guilford doesn't, and Putney doesn't. So I'm assuming you haven't gotten them, from the principals or any information from the schools. But how do you decide how much to spend on each school? Because we're supposed to be fairly equal on things like this. Thank you.
So I can speak generally to that. I know, for example, some of the schools had much more flushed out capital plans that were going long-term than other schools. For example, our Dummerston board did not have the kind of capital plan going on that other schools did. Some schools are in better shape than others, and so we do, for the Dummerston school, there are some pending projects. If you see in 2024, is that a new furnace and a roof we're talking about in the same year? Yes, a new roof and a new furnace for Dummerston in 2024. So that's the $279,000 if you look across FY 2024. So that year is a huge year for that particular school. The next year, there's nothing projected to be needed. So there's some little things along the way, but for that school, that's what we're looking at in 2024. If you'll notice at the top right-hand corner, it says project subject to board approval. So all of this is just our best guess on what we need. And I think now that we're through our first year almost, the schools that have not had the deep dive, we will be in a place to take a little better look at what various schools will need in 2020. You know, you shift priorities. If somebody else's furnace blows up, you've got to manage that. So it's just our projection to sort of make sure we have this, you know, on our plan and we know what we're looking at. And I think that's something that we could hone in the coming years. You had other questions, I bet, though.
Somebody else may.
Okay. Yes, Paul.
Paul Namendo from Dummerston. My question goes back to the supervisory union on page 48. And if we look at that, you know, revenues miraculously equal expenditures. Amazing how that happens. And what I'm curious about knowing is what is the net amount that is that goes through that flows through that we have to pay through our taxes. In other words, what, you get monies in from grants. You have a grant-funded program. So what is the net amount that that the schools themselves have to supply to support the SU? Can I have another question? Can I just, you want to stack them or do you want to?
It's pretty late in the day for me at this point, so if we could do one at a time. You know.
Okay.
I'm
Do you want to?
I'm not young like you, Paul. So.
Thank you very much. That's the nicest thing anybody's ever said to me.
So, well, I will just comment on the revenues have to equal expenditures because the SU has they don't have a money printing machine, they can't raise revenues, so their expenditures have to be reimbursed 100% by us. So in the case of the SU, they have to be equal because the SU isn't raising any funds, they're raising them from us, and the districts have to pay the SU. So, and I will then turn.
Yeah, but they're a grant. They get grants for like special ed, right? You get part of that's funded by the state. So I guess I'm curious, what is the net amount that we have to pay?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So what's the net amount of that 22 million on that side? So it's in various places that I can't add off the top of my head.
Yeah,
but let me hand it to you.
I bet Frank can.
I can. Page 21 of the expense budget in the annual report that you have there, that has a group. That this section of the report is organized by school site. Okay, so this is intended to be for the reader to see at each school site how much are we spending on instruction, how much on student support services, and on school operations and so on. As part of all of those, the site concept, one is the district-wide services. So what are those expenditures that serve all of the sites? And that's the question you're asking. Mm-hmm. So when you get to the supervisory union on page 21, that's all within the school district. Okay, the school district budget that Christina gave us an overview of 51 million. Part of that is in that, you see that middle section, 3096 is the location code that the state assigns, and it says WSED district-wide programs and services. So your question gets at the line there that is going from left to right, starts with the function code 2500. It says support services, SU, admin, instruction, and transportation. So of all of those numbers on page 48, 3,193,000 is the assessment to the school district for, as you say, the net of all of the state aid that comes in that the SU retains and then has to bill the town for. So it's 3,193,000 for those things, which are the admin, the supportive instruction, and the transportation services. And then in addition to that, the special education services that we just talked a fair amount about are just a couple of lines below that. You see under what's called Program 22, this is all part of a state coding system, and it says Special Education Services Pre-K through grade 12. You see that? That's the header, and then there's the line, the expenditure line. It says Support Services SU Special Education, $4,992,000. So it is the addition of that $3,193,000 plus that $4,992,000. You know, about $8 million.
Right, but that's what you assign to the local schools, right?
Right.
But how much do you get from the state?
Yeah, everything else in that budget is from the state. And, you know, we're talking in the forum of the Wyndham Southeast School District. So everything other than that $8 million comes from the state, other than, of course, Vernon. Vernon has to pay as well.
Right, okay. I'm with you.
So that's the answer.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Next question. Still back on page 48. I notice under expenditures, well, it doesn't make any difference which part you go to, expenditures or revenue side, but there was the F20 budget you have amended. Now, what was it amended? When was it amended? What was it amended to? And what was it amended for?
Yeah, great question. So years ago, when the world was a little bit simpler in education finance, you would have a town meeting, you'd set a budget, and that would just be a static number until you came back the next year and you saw what you voted on as the same number, and then you have a new proposed number. Several years ago, as the Agency of Ed has tried to standardize the financial reporting and the data collection that they do, they have required a number of changes, and one of them is this concept of if a grant is applied for and awarded subsequent to, let's say, today, or let's say March 17, in the old days, we used to just kind of have a spreadsheet that would say, well, here's what we published, and then here's all the stuff that came in after the date in which the town voted. But now they're saying we must have in the public record, in the general ledger, all of those amendments that occurred subsequent to a vote. So what the common theme in this concept of an amendment is it's always a grant program. It's always funded by a source other than the tax rate. So that means that when you see an amended budget, it doesn't mean that there's also an amended tax rate. The tax rate is what the voters voted on as adjusted by the legislature and at the end of every June. And amended budgets are reflecting grants that were applied for. I don't know if Paul's here, Paul Smith, but in general, the grants are our Title I, our Title II programs. Nancy Weiss, I think, is here at the Career Center. She's done a terrific job applying and receiving substantial amount of Perkins funding money for our Career Center. So it's those types of things.
Okay. Last one, if I may. I'm glad it's not a big crowd because you wouldn't let me do this. Concern about administration. You keep hearing, there's a lot of talk on the street, and yet I don't know how much of it is valid. That's why I'm asking this question. But we've heard that several positions were added to the SU budget, and it's a great place to hide additional staff if you want to, because it's hard to locate. But I've heard that there was statements made about hiring a facilities manager, number one, for all the schools in the area. One, I'd like to know if that's true or not. And not to point fingers at anybody, and I don't want to name names, but it was I heard there was a position that was created to mentor principals. And I'm curious, why do principals need mentoring? Because by the time you become a principal, I would tend to think that with all this, the workshops you go to and the education that you've attained, that you don't necessarily need mentoring. So I would like to, if that is the case, I would like to have an answer to those. Thank you.
So I do not think in this budget there were any positions added at the SU level. Is that correct?
Last year, diversity?
Yes. I don't believe there were any positions added at the supervisory union level with this budget, especially where our special ed numbers were coming in so high. It was a really difficult budgeting session season at the SU level. So I don't think, am I correct? There's no new personnel. We have a number of new principals in our district, and I bet everybody could use a mentor. I could have used a mentor in this job, let me tell you. But it's a state requirement that you have mentoring actually for principals. It's another thing that comes from on high. We could have hired in-house or had mentors come down from the VPA. We have an in-house mentor where we had a lot of new principals. But that was put in, I think Ron put that in. I think Ron created that position, so it's prior to merger. There's a state requirement that principals are mentored, that principals have access to mentoring.
Minimally 2 years. At least 2 years. Yes. Yep.
Any other questions? Jody, we've come so far. Thank you for waiting. Another question.
I have a couple of questions. Excuse me. One of them I think I know the answer to, but it's between the schools and it's the food. And Academy School, for example, has $85,000 on it. Oak Grove has 0, Green Street has 0, and BAMS and BUHF have 0. So I'm assuming that's because Academy creates the food for the Oak Grove and Green Street?
I believe that's correct, yeah.
And that because BUHS and BAMS is 0 because they have free lunches? Oh gosh, Frank. I just wrote down on the bottom of the page, so I'm on page 17, so I don't know where that went to. I was just taking them all together. If you go to Academy, you see 85,274, and I can't turn the pages with holding this.
Because
food service, it's down halfway in the page, 3,100, right, and it's 85,274.
and then
So is that because they prepare the food, so they get all the cost for all the food for Oak Grove and whatever? And then the high school, you said earlier that they get the free reduced lunches or whatever. The high school and BAMS both get that?
But there's a line for food service operations, page 17.
Yeah, that's one.
There's the third bar down is food service operations is $229,213 this year.
And that's under BUHS.
That's under BUHS, yes.
And so is BAMS a separate?
They're part of that.
They're part of that.
It's like Academy, yep.
Okay.
The whole school, yep.
Thank you. The other issue was transportation. And I noticed, Putney. I'm looking at Putney, for example, and 2,700, it says student transportation is up 47.6% with a figure of 9,300. And then you come down here further to 2,700 under the regular education, and you've got 4,000. I don't understand the discrepancies in the numbers.
Sorry, Jody, I'm trying to catch, can you just go over what the numbers were you were looking at? The 2,700?
2,700 under Putney Central School on page 19.
Okay.
You have student transportation, and it went up 47.6% at 9,300. And then you go down to the next section, 11, regular education total, and you got 2,700 student transportation at 4,000.
Right, that's for the summer school program.
Oh, that's under the summer school?
Yeah.
Okay, not under regular education.
Right, the regular education is for everything above it in that bold 11 line.
Okay, so what is the total of their transportation?
Looks to me like 13,300.
Okay. My second question along that is, what is different in the top section under Putney Central School for $3,000 increase in transportation? I mean, they've been transporting their kids like the rest of us have forever.
Oh.
Oh, yes.
Thanks. I'm Herv Pelletier, principal of Putney Central School. The discrepancy in the cost, I believe, has to do with the bus monitor, right? Am I correct on that?
It's part of it, but
Yeah.
also we've done a lot in the summer program.
Yeah.
In terms of increasing services, and we know we have to review that.
Right.
Emily did a committee report on that, and we see that. As far as the going from 6,300 to 9,300, that's in the general field trip budget of the school.
Right.
And what we've done is look back at the historical actual and found that the 9,300 was closer to our actual costs.
Right. And it's also worth mentioning that as far as the summer transportation budget goes, it would be much higher, frankly, if we didn't call on some friends at the Putney School for the loan of a minibus, which they were graciously supplied us with last summer at no cost. So all we had to do was put gas in it, so that was a big savings.
And I have one more question. On page 26, where we've got the resident student census, are those butts and seats or equalized students?
Those are butts in seats, correct?
Okay, thank you.
On October 10th, I believe, right? Or something like that, or thereabouts. Yeah. November 10th. Oh, off by a month. Any other questions on the budget? On any of the, we also have Lyle here, so any of the assessment data? Yes, Jody.
I forgot to say something, and I forgot to thank Frank and the administration for putting the page numbers on here, because in previous meetings it was very difficult to follow on that 130-something page budget, so thank you.
Any other questions? I would just like to mention, if you just give you a few minutes to think, the legislature is considering changing how equalized pupils are calculated. When in 1997, when the Brigham decision came through and we went to a statewide funding system, the idea was that everyone should have equal opportunity for education. And they made real guesses as to what it costs to educate certain types of students who might be a little bit more expensive to educate. But we're trying to give all students the same opportunity. After 20 years of asking, the legislature commissioned a report that came out in this past December that actually looked at the costs. It was a UVM, Rutgers, a couple other organizations. So it was a research study to figure out what it really costs to, is a high school student 1.13 times a regular education student? They didn't touch pre-K on this, I think, but what are the costs of educating a student who is learning English for the first time? So they came out with this research study, and it's dramatically different from what people guessed it would be at the legislature in 1997. The fiscal office at the legislature did a model, showing what would happen to districts. So education spending, if you didn't change education spending, but you counted students for taking into account what it will cost to educate them, it dramatically changes various districts. And ours is one that would be greatly helped by reconfiguring and using what's called the weighting analysis. The legislature is taking testimony tomorrow on this. As one could imagine, if we are winners and you're not spending any more money, some people will be quote unquote losers. Those people that are losers have been having their education subsidized at the expense of students who are living in poverty, students who are learning English, providing high school students with the opportunities that they need. So I don't view it as winners and losers. I view it as doing what should have been done in 1997. And I really take somebody who has been in education in Vermont for a long time. I was talking to him, and he said he read the study before he went to what I did, which is how does it affect the WSESD? Well, this gentleman read the whole study and made a determination of whether it was the fair thing or not, because he didn't want to think about how it affected his district. And he, without looking at the analysis of how it affected his community, he supported it because it was the fair thing, it was the right thing, it's what we should be doing under Brigham. And so I would like to think that I would feel that way if we were losers, but as I think about it, it's what is fair. And we really, if we're having a statewide funding system, we should be doing this weighting study. There's several good articles in the Brattleboro Reformer, had an opinion piece today. Laura Sibilia, who is a representative and been a long time on school boards from the Wilmington-Dover area. Anyway, she's really pushing for this legislation. So if you have a few minutes tonight, there is something on our website, a flyer that I did for town meeting day. There's a link on there to write your legislature and just advocate that the weighting study, please move on it, because people are talking about let's go slowly, let's wait. I'm all for phasing something in because dramatic changes in property taxes are difficult on schools and communities, but I think it's the right thing and the fair thing. And just for last year, our tax rate in their simulation, it would have gone from $1.71 to $1.53. So that's not to say that we would maybe bring our budget down to $1.53. Maybe we would split the difference. I can't speak for a future board if this were to happen, but it would give us an opportunity to perhaps lower our taxes and to perhaps provide more supports for children who are struggling and need that support. So if you have a minute, it'd be a really good use of your time to advocate for children living in very rural conditions in this state, children learning English, children who are living in economically disadvantaged situations. So it is on the WSESU website, correct? Can somebody, or just write to your representative. I attacked them all at our town meeting, and Jody Normando was close behind me. So. And oh yeah, and the school board has had a resolution on this as well, and so you could say you supported the WSESD's resolution. Jody.
I was also going to say that there's a fantastic letter, if anybody's on Vermont Digger today, from David Kelly, and it really makes you want to cry. He's up in the Northeast Kingdom where there is real poverty, and they've been gypped out. So.
Any other questions? Yes, Robin.
I just wanted to acknowledge a lot of work went into this, and I appreciate what everyone on this board has been doing for months, and also on the Brattleboro Finance Committee. And I noticed in their report, they said it would be more appropriate if a committee made up of members from all of the towns review this. I was just wondering if the school board had any ideas about how to form that.
We had a brief discussion about this at the Finance Committee level, and did we bring it to the full board for discussion? I don't think we spoke about it briefly at the Finance Committee level, but we had kind of a pile of work because of the Academy project at that level, so it's been pushed off. I think it would be a great idea And I'd love to volunteer for it. It'd be just the perfect thing for a nerdy math girl to do when she's retired from the board, because I know all this stuff, so I might as well use it for something occasionally. So I think it's a great idea, but that will be up to the next board going forward and to the people that have served on the Brattleboro Town Finance Committee, but it would make more sense to me. Thanks for the question. You want to speak for yourself, Franz Reichman?
Franz Reichman from Brattleboro and chair of the Representative Town Meeting Finance Committee that put together the little report that you've got. This is, I think, a kind of difficult question. Our report addresses it more or less in a theoretical way, that it would make sense for a committee that's doing a report like this to have representation from all the towns in the district. Just seems logical. And from there, though, how it would be authorized, where it would draw its legitimacy from, questions like that came up at the WSESD Finance Committee meeting that I was sitting in on. So there would be a lot of questions to answer, and just how it would be put together, I don't know. And I guess, the new board can talk about that, but the direction's unclear, but the principle seems clear, that if there's going to be a report like this written, it should come from a broad representative subgroup of the citizens of somebody. Thank you.
Thanks, Franz.
I mean, do you guys have anything like that in your town meetings? Are there committees for the towns?
So when we pass our budget in Dummerston, I can only speak for Dummerston, that's my only history is within Dummerston. People read through this with a fine-tooth comb. We don't need a committee because we have a committee of the 60 people that have served on boards in the past and say, what's going on? Did you buy 4 more brooms this year? Because I thought there were 3 brooms in the budget. Because it was a, $3 million, give or take, a $3 million budget. So there was not quite the need, I would say, in our smaller budgets to have that kind of review, whereas Brattleboro Town Schools were a more significant budget, and you're trying to balance needs and understand, had capital plans, and you may not know what the roof at Academy looks like because your children go to Green Street, whereas everybody in Dummerston knows the roof was leaking during the middle of the championship basketball game. So I think it's a different need level. So we had very robust conversations of the budget. It was walked through carefully, questions were asked, but there was no formal committee process in the smaller towns. And I think it's harder now, even than in Brattleboro was, because now it's a $51 million budget. So it's much harder to understand how things are apportioning. That is just my opinion, and it's a waning opinion. It'll be the next board that will take that up. So. Yes, absolutely.
I think it's safe to say that everybody on the board thinks it would be a good idea, and I think the way Franz laid it out is exactly the way it should happen. Probably the most appropriate place for it to come would be on the floor of the annual meeting next Wednesday. So I would encourage people to come and propose that we do that, and then that'll give us the authority, maybe not to do it, there'll probably be legal questions, but certainly to look into it and maybe set up a draft board. That's not the right word. A tentative board until we actually have a vote at an annual meeting to create it. But it would be the annual meeting that would create that.
Anything else?
Waiting study?
Oh, yes, the waiting study.
So if you go to the WSESD board, it's under press releases, March 5, 2020 press release, board resolution, change to student weighting formula. So you can find it there.
Thank you, Lyle. Yes, Paul.
Paul Memando. I'm looking at 2 things here. I'm looking at the tax rate sheet that you have, which shows equalized pupils of 2250.
Mm-hmm. 2253, yeah.
Yeah. And then when Jody asked the questions about butts in the seat on page 26, It says 2,509. No, it doesn't. Okay, I'm looking at, oh, that's non-member. I guess I'm looking at the wrong thing. It says 2219. I'm
Yep.
sorry. But also looking at that same sheet, I see that out of every town except Putney either stayed the same or dropped in butts in the seat. I want to congratulate Putney on their fecundity, and I would like to encourage other people to follow suit.
The chair will pass on that request personally, but yeah, but it also, that's just butts in the seat. So the equalized number is going to be different based on what's happening with free and reduced lunch levels and everything else. So, but yes, having more students would be a great idea for bringing our taxes down. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Well, excellent. I hope you're our ninjas on the budget now, and you can join us next Tuesday. Tuesday. Yeah. Next Tuesday, March 7th. I know it's a week from today. Thank you, David. Next Tuesday, March 17th, 7 p.m. We'll be in the BUHS gymnasium for our annual meeting and our budget presentation. In the meanwhile, if you have any questions, Sean. If you have any questions, you can email any of the board members.
I can't let this go by and not thank Christina for all that she's done. She's amazing, and you're going to be greatly missed.
I'm joining the O'Connor sisters as in the audience. So I'll get Kate and Carrie, and we're going to sit in the audience of the WSESD meeting. So you won't miss me. I'll still be here. So thank you all for coming tonight. I appreciate it. And I have finished a meeting in under an hour. Thanks, Jerry.